Good morning, children.
Morning, ma'am.
Only one joined. Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
We learned
Morning,
about types of pollination in the previous class. And which are the two types of pollination that we learned, Fia? Just name them. The moment I asked the question, where did you go? Yes. Two types, just the names. I'm not asking you to explain. Which are the two types of pollinations?
Cross pollination
And
and
cross pollination and Badra?
self pollination.
Cross pollination and self pollination. What is meant by self pollination, Hadibi? Without referring anywhere, you have to answer.
Self pollination means when in
Melvin, wait. Hadibi. She will say.
Self-pollination, the anther of the flower is transferred to the stigma of the seed.
Anther, the whole anther will get transferred, or some specific parts of anther?
Specific parts of anther.
What are they? What was the question that I asked you? Self-pollination. Self-pollination. So what is getting transferred?
Ma'am, some grains.
Pollination. What grains?
Pollen grains.
Transfer of, I understood that you all are revising your daily lessons. The transfer of?
Pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant.
Oh my God. Good. Now Vishnupriya, cross pollination. Somehow managed, no Hadibi? Vishnupriya, cross pollination.
Transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of another flower of different plant of same kind.
Very good. That is known as cross pollination. And pollination will be followed by Meghna. After pollination, what is the next step? Fertilization. Correct. So once the pollen has landed on the stigma, these pollen grains will germinate and will produce a pollen tube. Once again, once the pollen grains land on the stigma, they will germinate and produce a pollen tube. And this pollen tube will be growing towards the ovary. What for? Why the pollen grains are moving or growing towards the ovary? Aditya, M. Nair.
For fusion with the female gamete.
Through this pollen tube, what gets transferred?
Pollen.
What will get transferred through this pollen tube? I told pollen tube will grow towards the ovary. And once it reaches the ovary, what will be released from the pollen tube into the ovary or into the ovule? What will pass? Yes. Once again?
Male gamete.
Male gametes present in the pollen grains will move through the pollen tube and finally it will reach the ovary. Once it reaches the ovary, it will enter into the ovule where the embryo sac is present. So let's see the details. After the pollen grain lands on a suitable stigma, it will germinate. Upon germination, it will produce a pollen tube. I told if the pollen grain and the stigma are compatible, only this germination process will take place. If they are entirely, the pollen grain and the stigma, both are belonging to entirely different species of plants, it will not happen. Germination will not happen. But when these are related species, once the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it will germinate. And upon germination, produces a pollen tube. This pollen tube, from the stigma, it will grow through the tissues of style and finally reaches the ovule, which is present inside the ovary. Inside the ovary, ovule, And inside the ovule, there is embryo sac. Ovary is a part of pistil or carpel. Inside the ovary, ovule. Inside the ovule, embryo sac. These terms may not be there in your textbook. Embryo sac is not mentioned in your textbook. And inside the embryo sac, we have a female gamete or egg cell. Egg cell is the female gamete. Once again, inside the ovary, ovule is present. Inside the ovule, embryo sac. So here you can see the picture of an embryo sac. Second figure, embryo sac. Where is embryo sac? Inside the ovule. Where is ovule? Inside the ovary. Ovary, ovule, embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac, the egg cell is present. And children, in that figure you can find it is not only egg cell. Along with the egg cell, you can see many other structures also. Here you can see 2 synergids. Here you can see 3 antipodals. Here you can find 2 polar nuclei. And only this forms the egg cell. So this is the female gamete. But apart from the female gamete, so many other structures. Yes.
Mommy, is it XL or egg cell?
Pardon?
Is it XL or egg cell?
Egg cell, not X. Not X. It is egg cell. Okay. We call it as egg. Sperms and eggs. Once again, so other than the egg cell, only one egg cell, only one female gamete is present. But in each pollen grain, there will be 2 male gametes. Each pollen grain contains 2 male gametes, but there will be only one female gamete or egg cell inside the ovule. But you can see so many other cells over here. There are many other cells, 2 polar nuclei, 3 antipodals, 2 synergids on either side of the egg cell. But egg cell is just one. You don't have to learn the name of synergids, antipodals and all. One egg cell is present or the female gamete is present inside the embryo sac. Embryo sac is inside the ovule. Ovule is inside the ovary. Ovary, ovule, embryo sac, egg cell. Egg cell is present along with other structures. The embryo sac present inside the ovule contains 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, 2 synergids and 1 egg cell. Once again, 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, 2 synergids, 1 egg cell or 1 female gamete. Got it? Inside the ovary, ovule is present. Inside the ovule, embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac, female gamete or egg cell is present along with 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, 2 synergids. And the 2 polar nuclei at the center, you can see 2 polar nuclei over here. These 2 will fuse together and they form diploid secondary nucleus. The 2 polar nuclei at the center, they will fuse together and they will form diploid secondary nucleus. Diploid and haploid already had learned. Diploid means when the chromosomes are in the paired condition because 2 nuclei are fusing together. So the chromosomes will be in the paired condition. Okay. The 2 polar nuclei at the center will fuse and they will form a diploid secondary nucleus. Clear? Is that clear? Shall I proceed?
Wait, ma'am.
Okay. Pollen lands on stigma and then it germinates. Upon germination, it will produce a pollen tube. And this pollen tube will grow through the stigma and style and reaches the ovule. Inside the ovule, embryo sac is present, and inside the embryo sac, there'll be only one female gamete or egg cell. Along with the female gamete or egg cell, there'll be 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, and 2 synergids. And the 2 polar nuclei will fuse and form diploid secondary nucleus. Diploid secondary nucleus. Each pollen grain contains 2 male gametes or 2 male germ cells. 2 male gametes or 2 male germ cells are present inside each pollen grain. But inside each embryo sac, only one female gamete. You should not get confused. 2 male gametes per pollen grain. And one of them, out of the 2 male gametes, one will fuse with the egg cell. And you call this process as fertilization. So one of the male gamete, you know that at a time, only one male gamete can fuse with a female gamete. So out
Ma'am, we can't hear you.
Recording in progress.
can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Once again, I will repeat. Each pollen grain contains 2 male gametes. And one of them will fuse with the egg cell. And it will form zygote, that is fertilization. We even call it as syngamy, same as fertilization, syngamy or fertilization. Out of the 2 male gametes, one will fuse with the female gamete and forms a zygote. You call the process as syngamy. And now one more male gamete is remaining. What that male gamete will do? It will fuse with diploid secondary nucleus. Diploid secondary nucleus. How is diploid secondary nucleus formed? One of you tell me, how is diploid secondary nucleus formed?
2 polar
Yes, 2 polar nuclei fuse together and they will form a diploid secondary nucleus. So the second male gamete will fuse with that and it will form pen or primary. P for primary, E for endosperm, N for nucleus. It will form primary endosperm nucleus, abbreviated as PEN or PEN. And here it is given triploid. Why? Because 2 polar nuclei plus 1 male gamete. 3 cells are fusing, even though already they have fused. The polar nuclei have fused together to form a diploid secondary nucleus. It is diploid, or else you can say this one is diploid already. So diploid plus one more set of chromosomes. So it will be triploid. 3 cells or 3 nuclei are getting fused here. The nuclei of the male gamete and the 2 sets of nuclei of polar nuclei. 2 polar nuclei are fusing. So diploid plus one more set. So triploid. So you call it as triploid primary endosperm nucleus or PEN, PEN. Have you understood, children? So once again, I will repeat it. I told you there are 2 male gametes present in each pollen grain, 2 male gametes. And out of this, one male gamete will fuse with egg cell, that is female gamete. And you call this process as syngamy. It results in the formation of a zygote and the process is known as syngamy. This is syngamy. Same as fertilization. So one of the male gamete fuses with the female gamete and a zygote will be formed. Now, what will happen to the second one? The second male gamete will fuse with diploid secondary nucleus formed by the fusion of two polar nuclei. Diploid secondary nucleus, and they will result in the formation of PEN. What is PEN? Triploid primary endosperm nucleus. And this process, the first process I told, you call it as syngamy. And the second fusion, you call it as triple fusion. Why triple fusion? Because two polar nuclei, they are fusing with the male gamete. The diploid secondary nucleus is formed by the fusion of two polar nuclei, and that is fusing with the male gamete. So it involves three sets of or three nuclei. So we call it as triple fusion. Triple fusion and syngamy. Triple fusion and syngamy. Is it clear, children? Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
I'll repeat it again for those who join late and for those who haven't understood. Each pollen grain contains two male gametes. One of the male gamete will fuse with egg cell and it will form a zygote. You call the process a syngamy. And now the other male gamete will fuse with diploid secondary nucleus. How is a diploid secondary nucleus formed, children? How is it formed? How is diploid secondary nucleus formed? Melvin? By the fusion of? So attentive. Huh? Who can tell me? Melvin, find out and tell me. Yes?
Answer the question again.
How is diploid secondary nucleus is formed? What results in the formation of a diploid secondary nucleus? Fusion of? How many times I am repeating, children? How many times? What results in the formation of a diploid secondary nucleus? Fusion of what?
Two polar nuclei.
Fusion of two polar nuclei. That will result in the formation of a diploid secondary nucleus. And this diploid secondary nucleus will fuse with the other male gamete and it will form PEN. Triploid primary endosperm nucleus. I told you why it is not a triploid. Because here two polar nuclei is fusing with one male gamete. So PEN, primary endosperm nucleus, and the first fusion is syngamy. The second fusion, where the male gamete is fusing with the diploid secondary nucleus, you call it as triple fusion. Syngamy and triple fusion. And since it is involving two fusions or two fertilization, you call it as double fertilization. First is syngamy. Second one, triple fusion. So since it involves two types or two fusions, you call this process of fertilization as double fertilization. Why it is known as double fertilization? Because it involves two fusions. Which is the first fusion? Fusion of male gamete with female gamete to form a zygote. And second fusion? Fusion of two polar nuclei with the male gamete. And you call it as triple fusion. Triple fusion is the first, second one. Syngamy is the first one. So syngamy and triple fusion. Two fusions are involved. So you call the process as double fertilization. Is that clear? Now let's see what happens to the products of these fusions. Zygote. What are the products? The first fusion results in the formation of zygote. First fusion results in the formation of a zygote. Second fusion results in the formation of pen. And zygote, as you had already learned, it will develop into embryo. And it is from the embryo a new individual is being formed. Now, what happens to pen? Pen develops into endosperm. Primary endosperm nucleus will develop into endosperm. And what is the significance of endosperm? If embryo needs to grow, they need nourishment. If embryo needs to grow, it should get sufficient nourishment, and that will be provided by this endosperm. Zygote will develop into embryo. From the embryo, a new individual will be formed. Whereas PEN, triploid primary endosperm nucleus, will develop into endosperm. And why this endosperm is important? Because it will provide nourishment to the growing embryo. Is it clear? Double fertilization. You want me to repeat it again? You want me to?
Yes, ma'am.
Once again, I will repeat. Some are saying yes, some are saying no. Whether you say yes or no, once I ask you the questions, I should get the answers. I am ready to repeat any number of times. I'll repeat it once again. Listen carefully. Once the pollen grain lands on a stigma, it will germinate and produce a pollen tube. This pollen tube will grow through the tissues of stigma and style, and it will reach the ovule. And inside the ovule, there is embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac, there is female gamete. And along with the female gamete, there will be 2 synergids, 3 antipodals, and 2 polar nuclei inside the embryo sac. The 2 polar nuclei will fuse and form a diploid secondary nucleus. Now, out of the 2 male gametes present inside each pollen grain, one will be fusing with the female gamete to form a zygote. And you call this fusion as syngamy. And the zygote will develop into embryo. Embryo will gradually form a new individual. Whereas the other male gamete will fuse with the diploid secondary nucleus and will form a triploid primary endosperm nucleus or pen. And this pen will change into endosperm for nourishing the growing embryo. Am I clear? Am I clear to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Now let's see whether you have understood or not. Okay, we'll start from Hadidi, you were waiting for me to stop sharing. Let me revise, recap. After that, I will show you. And half of the videos are off. I'll take a photo and post in the class group now. I'll do that then. Okay.
Ma'am.
Yes.
What's the last word?
Last
Word of the slide.
Last part of the slide.
Word.
Ma'am,
Word.
last sentence, that point.
Endosperm, that is upon fusion. Once triple fusion is completed, that structure will form endosperm. Endosperm will provide nourishment to the growing embryo. Okay. Triple fusion means the 2 polar nuclei or the secondary diploid secondary nucleus is fusing with the male gamete. You call the fusion as triple fusion. It will result in the formation of endosperm, and endosperm provides nourishment to the growing embryo. Surya, Haya, Savio, Afsana, Johan, I'm not joking. I'll take a photo and I'll post it right now. Okay. Surya, Johan, Sainaba. If only 1 or 2 names are there, I'll post the names. Savio, did you understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now you start. Start. Once the pollen lands on the stigma, what happens? Pollen has landed on the stigma. What is next step? Don't disappoint me, child.
That after landing on
What happens? The pollen will?
it will break.
Who can help him? Pollen will
Germinate to produce pollen
germinate.
tube.
Savio, repeat it.
The pollen grains after landing on stigma it will germinate
And
And-
forms?
and from zygote
Forms what? Where were you? What tube? What tube it forms?
I thought 3 and
Savio, you listen to me. Pollen germinates and forms a tube. So how can you name it? Pollen germinating and forming a tube. What is the name of the tube?
pollen tube.
Pollen tube. Be attentive. Then, Rifa, what is next? Pollen tube has germinated. To where it will grow?
And that tube will connect and this, it will go through that tube.
Yes?
Ma'am, this
It will grow through
the tube will end in ovary.
ovule. But through where it is growing? Through the tissues of? Somebody guide her. Through the
Stigma
tissues
and
of
style.
stigma and style. It will grow through the tissues of style, stigma and style, and finally reaches the ovule. What is there inside the ovule, Aditya? Aditya's video is stuck. What is inside the ovule?
Female
Inside the ovule. What do you call that sac?
embryo sac.
Embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac, Ashik, what are present inside the embryo sac?
3 nuclei.
Yes?
3 nuclei.
Three nuclei, just three nuclei. Inside the embryo sac, what are the structures present inside?
And the
Enough, Savio. I will give you a chance later. Your quota is over for today. Adil, tell me. Yes, Vishnu, you can rejoin. Adil, unmute and speak. What are the structures present inside embryo sac? I think minimum 5 times I have repeated. Minimum.
Inside embryos.
Ah. Say, haven't you noted it down?
Ma'am.
Ah. Say. This is so disappointing, children. You should consider the energy being wasted. How much energy? If you're not answering, means our energy has gone waste. Nirupama, what are the different structures present inside embryo sac?
3 antipodals,
3 antipodals,
1 egg
1 egg
cell,
cell,
2 polar nuclei,
2 polar nuclei, and 2
synergic.
synergic. Thank you, child. Good. So these are the different structures present inside. And each pollen grain will have how many male gametes, Prajod? Each pollen grain, how many male?
2.
2. And what happens to the first one? Badra, what happens to the first one? One of them.
One of the male gametes fuses with egg cell to form zygote.
What do you call the process?
Syngamy or fertilization.
Syngamy. Good. Then what happens to the second one, Adidev? Second one.
Second one of
It will fuse with
it will fuse with secondary nucleus.
diploid secondary
Good.
nucleus, and it will form what?
Pen.
Pen. Can you expand pen?
Primary endosperm.
Primary endosperm nucleus. And now this fusion, what do you call? Do you remember that, Adidev? What do you call the second fusion? Second fusion, what do you call? Triple fusion. Okay. And as a result of triple fusion, we get a pen or primary endosperm nucleus. What will happen to this primary endosperm nucleus? John, what happens to primary endosperm nucleus? It will develop into?
It will develop into zygote.
Listen, the answer is in the question itself. Primary endosperm nucleus will develop into The question carries the answer.
Endosperm.
Endosperm. It will develop into endosperm. What is the function of endosperm, John? And Mary, function of endosperm?
Nourishment of embryo.
Nourishment of the embryo. And for those who haven't followed or those who are having confusion, even Hadidi had asked me to show it once again. So quickly, I will give a recap of the same and then I'll proceed to the next topic. After the pollen lands on a suitable stigma, it will germinate and it will produce a pollen tube. This pollen tube will grow through the tissues of stigma and style and reaches the ovule. And you know, ovule is present inside the ovary. And inside the ovule, there'll be embryo sac, and the embryo sac contains 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, 2 synergids, and 1 egg cell. Egg cell is same as female gamete. And the 2 polar nuclei which are present at the center will fuse together and form a diploid secondary nucleus. Now we will see what happens to these male gametes present inside the pollen grain. One of the male gamete will fuse with the female gamete or egg cell and result in the formation of a zygote. And you call this fusion as syngamy. Now the other male gamete will fuse with those 2 polar nuclei or the diploid secondary nucleus formed by the fusion of 2 polar nuclei and result in the formation of a triploid. Why it is triploid, I told you, because here 2 polar nuclei and 1 male gamete is fusing. So 3 of them are involved. So it is triple fusion and we get triploid primary endosperm nucleus pen. Primary endosperm nucleus. It is triploid, 3 sets of chromosomes because 3 nuclei are fusing. Since this process or this fertilization is involving 2 fusions, one is syngamy, second one is triple fusion, you call the process of the fertilization as double fertilization. The zygote, once the fertilization process is completed, it will develop into embryo, whereas pen will develop into endosperm. And pen is also equally important because pen is changing into endosperm, and this endosperm provides nourishment to the growing embryo. Clear? Clear, children? Arjun?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, this is also very important. This can be asked for 2 marks, so 1 mark. What are the changes in a flower after fertilization? In descriptive paper, I've seen this particular topic being asked for 2 marks or 1 mark. Changes in flower after fertilization. You know that flower is the reproductive part of the plant and fertilization is taking place inside the flower. To be specific, inside the ovule, inside the embryo sac, fertilization is happening. And once fertilization is completed, the petals, sepals, stamen. So the male part, then petal, sepal, the first 3 whorls. The 3 whorls will be completely, 3 layers will completely disappear. Petals, sepals, and stamens. And from the female reproductive part, style and stigma, not the ovary. Style, stigma, then petals, sepals, and stamens will shrivel and fall off. They'll get dried up and they will fall off. Whereas the ovule develops a tough coat around it and forms seed. And the ovary will change into fruit. Ovary becomes fruit and ovule becomes a seed. The seed contains the future plant or embryo. So ovule is developing a tough coat around it and forming a seed. And inside the seed, the embryo, you know that it is present within the ovule. So the seed contains a future plant or embryo, and when suitable conditions are provided, they can germinate into a new plant. The ovary will ripen and form a fruit. Ovary becomes fruit, ovule becomes a seed. Sometimes you interchange and write ovule becomes fruit and ovary becomes seed. But don't get confused. Ovary is outside, ovule is inside. So seed will be inside, no? So ovary becomes fruit and ovule becomes seed. Once again, once fertilization is completed, the following changes take place in a flower. Petals, sepals, stigma, style, shrivel, and they will fall off. Now these are no longer needed. Now the remaining parts, ovule. Ovule is present inside the ovary. Ovary will ripen and form the fruit. Whereas the ovule inside the ovary develops a tough covering around it and changes into seed. And within the seed, the future plant or embryo will be present. And if the seed is given appropriate conditions, they will germinate and form a new plant. It will germinate and form a seedling. And from the seedling, the new plant will be produced. Have you understood? This is very important. Changes taking place in the flower after fertilization. Petals, sepals, stigma and style will shrivel and fall off, whereas the ovule and ovary undergoes changes. Ovary ripens and forms the fruit. Ovule will develop a tough covering and forms the seed. And inside the seed, the future plant or embryo will be present. And when suitable conditions, proper warmth, moisture, etc. are provided, they will germinate and form a new plant. Do you need more explanation?
Can you show the previous slide?
Yes, yes. You want me to repeat or just to see the slide?
See.
Okay.
Slide.
You want me to explain? The petals?
No, ma'am.
No need. Okay. Petals, sepals, stamen, style, stigma, all those parts will shrivel and fall off, but not ovary and ovule. Ovule will develop a tough covering and it will change into seed. And inside the seed, we have the future plant or embryo. Then when suitable conditions are provided, proper warmth, moisture, etc. are given, they will germinate into, or they will produce, or they will develop into a new seedling. You call it as germination. From class 6 or 5, you are learning about all these. Whereas the ovary will ripen and changes into fruit. Okay?
Ma'am, shrivel means?
It will get dried off. Thank you, children. Revise the portions. See you next class.